on this and other issues, but especially the Roma. Thank you so much. Mr. Gergely?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my gratitude on behalf of the European Roma Rights Center to be invited to this prestigious event in order to testify about the human rights situation of Roma in Europe. And with your approval, I would like my full statement to be included in the record. Distinguished representatives of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen, a recent European Union survey on minorities and discrimination highlights that on average 1 in 5 Roma respondents were victims of racially motivated personal crime at least once in previous 12 months. 81% of Roma who indicated that they were victims of assault, threat, or serious harassment considered that their victimization was racially motivated. Between 65% and 100% of Roma in the surveyed European countries did not report their experiences of personal victimization to the police. The main reason given by the Roma was that they were not confident that the police would be able to do anything. This lack of confidence is not surprising to someone familiar with Roma in Europe, and I will explain why. 2 weeks ago, the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers adopted an official declaration to express deep concern about the rise of anti-Gypsyism and violent attacks against Roma, which constitute a major obstacle to the successful social inclusion of Roma and a full respect of their human rights. The fact is that the racist or stigmatizing anti-Roma rhetoric has been on the rise in public and political discourse, including accusations that Roma, as an ethnic group, are engaged in criminal behavior. There are well-documented examples from France, from Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, or Czech Republic, and in some cases these words were understood as encouraging violent action against the Roma, such as mob riots or violence. Extremist groups, political parties, and politicians have sharpened their anti-Romani rhetoric and actions, galvanizing segments of the public against Roma in Hungary, Czech Republic, North Bohemia in particular, or Bulgaria. Anti-Gypsy stereotypes also continue to be spread and perpetrated in the media across Europe, which report primarily on Roma in the context of only social problems and crime. Violence against Roma remains a serious problem, not only because it harms Roma directly affected by the attacks, but because Roma, as an ethnic group, are impacted by the lack of effective response by state authorities. In 2011, the European Roma Rights Center published a report examining the state response to 44 selected attacks against Roma in Czech Republic, in Hungary, and Slovakia. And a number of shortcomings in the state response to violence against Roma are apparent. Many Roma victims of violent crimes do not secure justice. A limited number of perpetrators of violent attacks against Roma are successfully identified, investigated, and prosecuted. Even fewer are eventually imprisoned for the crimes they have committed against Roma. At the time of publications, judgments finding the perpetrators guilty have been reached in 9 out of the 44 selected cases. Of those 9 cases, only 6 resulted in imprisonment, several under appeal, and 3 resulted in suspended sentences or fines, including persons with no affiliations to neo-Nazi groups in Czech Republic, for example. Police investigations were suspended with no perpetrator identified in 27% of all the cases. Racial motivation was confirmed in only 3 out of 44 selected cases of violence against Roma. In 11 other cases, racial motivation is included in the indictment of in pending cases, and in 50% of all the selected cases, racial motivation of the crimes committed against Roma was ruled out or not confirmed. The failure of law enforcement authorities to identify the perpetrators of crimes against Roma in a considerable number of investigations creates a climate of impunity and may encourage further acts of violence against Roma. The issuance by courts of only suspended prison sentences to persons found guilty of serious crimes against Roma reinforces the message that it is okay to attack Roma. Recognition of racial motivation in such a small number of cases may indicate a low level of importance placed on aggravated circumstances of the crimes committed and may fail to account for the full nature of the attacks. These findings may have a serious negative impact on the will of the Romani individuals to report crimes committed against them to law enforcement authorities and explains the results of the European Union Survey on Minorities and Discrimination. How can governments, put an end to impunity, restore confidence of Roma in law enforcement, and reduce the level of violence? First, government must adopt a zero-tolerance policy against racist speech uttered by public officials. All such racist speech should be immediately denounced and the responsible official removed from his or her job. Racist speech by private actors should be also vigorously condemned by government at the highest level. It is important that the government distinguish between free expression, which must be protected in a democratic society, and acts of intimidation, which must be strongly suppressed through acts of law enforcement. The spectacle of neo-Nazis carrying flaming torches through Roma settlements, shouting anti-Romani epithets, preventing people from going to their jobs or to schools, as occurred in several countries, Hungary or Bulgaria, for example, must not be allowed to recur. Most important of all, governments must take a firm stance against racially motivated violence. They should guarantee speedy and effective investigations and prosecutions of all crimes committed against Roma and identify any racist motives for such acts so that the perpetrators do not go unpunished and escalation of ethnic tension is avoided. Governments should ensure full assistance, protection, and compensation for the victims of violence. Last year, the EU launched an important process to promote Roma integration, focusing on education, on health, employment, and housing. Member states of the EU are obliged to develop and implement strategies for such integration, but it is crucial that the states recognize the interdependence of inclusion and anti-discrimination. Any strategy developed to improve the social and economic situation of Roma must include measures combating discrimination and addressing anti-Gypsyism. The United States has long been a leading global example in ensuring the inclusion of minorities in society. Last week, the US announced its intention to become an official observer of the Decade of Roma Inclusion, another important European initiative designed to encourage Roma advancement. Here is how the US, from our point of view, can assist Europe as it tries to achieve true integration of Roma at all levels of society. Offer the assistance of US law enforcement in addressing bias crimes against Roma. Offer good practices examples of promoting minority inclusion in education, in housing, healthcare, or employment. Offer financial assistance to civil society organizations in Europe addressing anti-Romani discrimination and rights violation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Gergely, thank you very much for your testimony and your extraordinary leadership on this very, very important human rights issue. Let me ask a couple of questions, starting off with the anti-Roma riots, which are increasing. The fact that they're occurring throughout the EU countries is shocking in and of itself, and then some have the gall to call it demonstrations, which is, a misnaming to a huge extent. What proactive steps are the governments taking to mitigate this incitement that's occurring and much of the violence that then ensues from these bogus called demonstrations, these riots? Mr. Mirga.
The question you pose brings some challenge, yes, because we, in fact, do not have much to report as a positive steps to counter such phenomena like extreme right and what they do campaigning against the Roma. We know about some steps taken, for example, in Czech Republic to prison some of the leaders of the extreme right, but they are finding a way to get out, of course, and we know about some steps in Hungary to delegalize a Magyar Guard, for example, but they are reappearing under new name, yes, so they are still able to organize marches. I think that the main objective of this kind of groups is to benefit during the election time, yes, because they are trying to get public support by stirring up at that time, especially anti-Roma slogans, rhetorics, because they believe this can give them votes. And as we warned in 2009 when I was here, I said that one test case will be Jobbik, and just after we learned that it became the third force in the country. So that is a telling story. We also know about some cases which were very positively handled, like in the case of Natalka in Czech Republic. The court sentenced the perpetrators, but after we heard some statement of the state officials which a little bit undermined, were trying to undermine the court sentence, which again is something which should be probably not happening in this situation. So we are kind of we receive something like ambiguous messages. Yes, on one hand, we see some reaction which is proper, as I said, for example, court cases which are highly appreciated, but again, from the politicians, we are receiving a mixed messages, which, as I said, should be here. The line should be kept, and the message should be one, condemning such situations.
Thank you.
I would only like to add the fact that even though we cannot name these proactive measures, what it is extremely crucial is speed and effective response. Unless a government does not react to violent riots or mob riots attempting to attack communities, which happened in several countries, as long as there is no reaction in defending these communities, of course that it would spread out. And this is the case of Bulgaria, where last year we could see in more than 15 cities mass protests against the Roma communities. The state response was initially slow. When the law enforcement officials reacted, they could manage the mobs. In Czech Republic, it was the same. It is even interesting that when the mobs were stopped by the police, the mobs were shouting, "You are defending gypsies." So law enforcement officials have to defend gypsies. This is what they have to do, to act and to ensure protection.
Mr. Berger, let me ask you, as you know, OSCE participating states are charged with collecting hate crime data and providing that to ODIHR. Have the countries provided information on these hate crimes to ODIHR as it relates to Roma?
Well, we, with TND and other departments, we are preparing such reports every year. There is a standard questionnaire sent to governments to get some response to. In fact, we are receiving very few information from countries about the cases of racial hate crimes or
Did they give an
attacks,
explanation? And could you provide to our commission those countries that have responded and those that have not? And do you find the quality of that information is, are you encouraged that those that do respond are actually doing their due diligence?
Well, we are trying to encourage
I know you are,
governments.
but I'm talking about the countries in terms of their response.
Oh, yeah. I think that governments who provide us information, there are few, yes? I don't want to name them here, but there are few, yes?
Yeah, it would be helpful if you would.
Yes.
Put you on the spot.
I can't
Okay.
at the moment, yes? But there are really few, yes? And in general, we do not have much information. So we have to rely on other sources coming from the civil society mostly, yes? And this has to be checked,
Exactly.
yes. We have, for example, yes, I am from Poland, yes, and I am closely monitoring the situation because I am Roma from Poland, and I have a good relationship with the Ministry of Interior, and they are providing us any data if we wish to have, yes, and they are providing. In some countries, it's more difficult to get such information.
As the European Roma Rights Center has pointed out in a report on human trafficking, that research in Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania and Slovakia during early 2010 indicated that Roma represent 50 to 80% of victims in Bulgaria, at least 40% in Hungary, 70% in Slovakia, and up to 70% in parts of the Czech Republic. Our own U.S. government TIP report, Trafficking Persons Report, and I would note parenthetically, I wrote the law, it's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that created our response, includes that tip report. Well, in the annual report, country by country, it makes for very disturbing reading, country after country, with regards to Roma. For example, in Hungary, Roma victims are overrepresented in trafficking victims from Hungary. Roma women and girls who grow up in Hungarian orphanages are highly vulnerable to internal sex trafficking. Pardon me. With regards to Romania, that there are reports that ethnic Roma criminal groups in Romania exploited Romanians throughout Europe. There is a very disturbing statement, and this runs through these, that some did not approach police out of fear of traffickers' reprisals. There's others who said they didn't want to go to the police because they're not sure which side the police were on. In the Slovak Republic, the comment is made that the government's poor relations with the Roma community resulted in significant problems in victim identification and prosecutions, including a government estimate that only 1/3 of all trafficking cases involving Roma are investigated. In other words, 2/3 are not. And it goes on and on. You know, you read country after country. You know, trafficking is modern-day slavery, whether it be labor or sex trafficking, and as both of you know so well, the ODIHR and the OSCE is certainly absolutely committed, as are you, Mr. Gergely. Could you speak to the issue of trafficking of Roma and elaborate on some of those numbers, if you would, and the fact that law enforcement ought to be absolutely proactively and aggressively, as well as the governments that support law enforcement, on the side of these victims? Please speak to it.
Well, as regards trafficking, it's ODIHR is involved in supporting some of the programs or projects on anti-trafficking, and the focus is on the victims. Yes, we are trying to obtain some more concrete data from some countries. Yes, recently we were very much focused to provide some support to Albania, for example, and for some activities there on Roma who are trafficked abroad. It seems to be one of the key issues for a number of countries in Western Balkans. Yes, this ongoing process. To obtain, however, data is one of the challenging things. We, in fact, missing concrete numbers. Yes, disregard that there is a number of agencies dealing with these issues. Yes, and NGOs who are involved. I was recently visiting Italy, where we were supporting some civil organizations dealing with trafficked Roma families, children mostly, and we visited a center for children trafficked in Rome, yes, where NGOs are taking care and taking them from the street there. We visited families who were involved in were victims of trafficking as well, and they were placed in some camps. We're trying to obtain more information, what is the extent of the issue, how numerous are this population, for example, in Rome, yes, and what are these countries from where they were trafficked. Most of them were from Western Balkan countries, and some of them, especially children, from Romania. So that was what our findings was, but again, to obtain concrete data about numbers, it was quite difficult. When we are working with trying to talk to those agencies, state agencies, police, we do not again get something concrete. That is the main concern, that it's difficult to get something real. The other issue which emerged also in Italy and France, in other countries, is about the expulsion policy or the treatment of women, children who are sometimes on the street begging or doing other things. We are trying to talk to some of the governments that the the effort to get rid of these people, yes, from the streets, yes, and to deport them, should be maybe rethinked, yes, because some of the women with children may be victims of trafficking, and for the second time you are just punishing them by deporting back in a very straightforward way, whereas those people may be a subject for care, because we have to recognize who is a real victim and who is not a real victim of the trafficking. And here, I think still there is very little understanding of the part of the enforcement bodies who would like to see these women, children as simply organized by mafia, yes, and disregard that they consider that they are victims, they are expelling them immediately without due consideration for their situation. And this is something concerning.
I think that there are a couple of issues which we have to underline when we speak about trafficking, as well as when we speak about hate crimes or other similar related areas. And on the first place, we have to be aware of the fact that the Roma minority, it is placed in a major discrepancy situation in comparison with the majority of the populations in the European countries in terms of social, economic, educational situation. This low level puts them in extremely high risks in terms of being victims of trafficking or being victims of other sort of crimes. There are two things which we have to underline here. First of all, there is a lack of a disaggregated data on the basis of ethnicity when we are speaking about minorities which are victims of trafficking. We do not have information to what extent, and when I say information, I'm saying official information coming from the governments on to what extent this phenomenon is affecting the Roma minority. And secondly, due to this fact that we are lacking official data, we lack also policies targeting these particular groups which are affected by the trafficking, for example. So basically we do have policies which are targeting trafficking, but we do not have targeted policy to the victims of trafficking, in our case, the Roma women or children. So this is something which needs to be addressed.
Are groups like IOM and others at least attempting working with governments?
There are several examples of cooperation, of course. But the problem is that when you have a state policy which is not targeting by its policy a vulnerable group and seeing exactly the extent of the situation and trying to really tackle in a particular way that phenomenon, it's really hard to see improvement, and unfortunately we can see the same situation in other areas of concern. We are lacking data on health situation, we are lacking data on the unemployment situation, we are lacking data on several areas. And because of this lack of information, we don't know, first of all, to what extent we have the problems, and secondly, to what extent the governments are addressing the problems, fully or not.
Let me ask you, with the recent European court case which concluded that sterilization of Romani woman from Slovakia violated the European Convention on Human Rights, called it cruel and inhumane, and I understand there are at least 5 more similar cases pending against Slovakia. Obviously, forced sterilization is an egregious form of violence. Is it continuing? Is it systematic? Your view on that? And then I'll yield to my colleague, and then I'll come back to some additional questions.
First of all, of course, this is a major decision from the European Court of Human Rights, and it has a major impact on this topic. I have to say that there are several similar cases pending before courts in other countries as well, and I would only name Czech Republic, for example, where there are a couple of cases pending before the national courts. Last year there was a successful case before the Supreme Court which acknowledged this, and a victim had received compensation. There is a similar situation in Hungary as well. There are cases before national courts pending until now. And also, as you mentioned, there are several cases pending before the European Court. Now, it is quite difficult to state whether this phenomenon is systematic still. But what it is clear is that in several member states, there is a lack of ensuring process of compensation for victims of sterilization. We have to say that many of these victims were sterilized during the communist regime, so before '89, and they could not raise those cases at the time.
Like in China, where women are routinely forcibly sterilized.
We have to take into account that in several countries there are time bars. So for a victim, it's really difficult to raise a case now after 20 years. So I think that what we need here is from the governments to take a positive step in to ensure on the first place a compensation procedure for the victims, and secondly to ensure that such acts would not be repeated anymore, meaning that you have to have a full and informed consent when you deal with such a situation. Without any consent, we cannot speak about this.
Right. Well, you know, just for the record, in places even like in Mexico, there are hospitals, they call them Social Security hospitals, where women, particularly indigenous women, give birth. Unknown to them, they, in some cases, have gotten tubal ligations. In other words, they've been sterilized. And I'll never forget work that I was involved in Peru, and still am. Upwards of 100,000 women were sterilized, many of them at health fairs, when President Fujimori very erroneously thought that one way to combat poverty was to eliminate the possibility of poor people giving birth to children who might be poor as well. A bit of a presumptuous thought to begin with. And I actually held a series of hearings on it, and it was amazing. He took his impetus for that from the population conference in Cairo, that you need to adopt a sterilization mentality and quickly cross the line from voluntary sterilization to forced. And it was awful. And so I'm glad you're very much on the forefront of trying to prevent and to provide compensation for those who have been so harmed by the government. Oh yes, Mr. Mirga.
I will just to say that we do not see that there is something like a systemic continuation of sterilization. I think that the cases which were brought up very much contributed to raise awareness, yes, which is important. We still need to get to the compensation issue. This is another step to be made, yes. There are some cases of the national courts, yes, which recognize also the sterilization against Roma women, and that is also very important, that it's not only from the European level court, but also from the national. So I believe there is a step forward, but we have to push a little bit further to get to fully to have those who are doing this responsible for these acts, yes, and compensation should follow.
Robert, you ready? I yield to Commissioner Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony here today and for your presence. One thing that we hear concerning this issue that really what involves us hearing is we hear from a lot of extremist parties the anti-Roma sentiment, but many examples of anti-Roma statements come from public figures associated with what we'd call normal parties or mainline parties across the political spectrum. My question would be, has extremism against the Roma gone mainstream? And can you give us a more nuanced understanding of this phenomenon?
Thank you. Well, we see a danger that rhetoric, anti-Roma rhetoric, which pays, can be adopted also by mainstream parties. And this is kind of an approach to preempt maybe the support for the extremists, so you are bringing in some kind of rhetoric to attract more voters during the elections. We notice, we observe that some of the mainstream parties or leaders of the, or members of the mainstream parties are using the same sometimes language as it was in case of extreme right parties. Yes. So it becomes more tolerable to speak the language which usually we associate with extreme. And this is something really worrying. Whether this is a preempting something or new strategy to get more votes, or simply people feel more free to speak racist language because they do not meet strong reaction from the public or condemnation. This is something to discuss, but we see this kind of phenomenon present. The second thing is that we see in the Europe a tendency or trend that extreme parties are winning. They are getting more votes, yes. Finland, for example.
You say Finland?
Finland, yes. A nationalist extreme right party made some winning, yes. UK, for the first time, extreme right get into parliament. Jobbik, we already talked about, yes. So, and in a number of countries, you can notice this trend that those who are playing with anti-immigrant, anti-minority, anti-Jew, anti-Roma, anti-Muslim, they are getting votes. This pays. And this may be attractive strategy for mainstream parties because they may become losers. Yes, they will. If extreme will win, they will lose. So they have to think how to eventually, what kind of strategy have to develop. The easiest seems sometimes for some of them to be a little bit radical and play for these voters who are in the crisis, are trying, maybe because of the crisis, they are getting a little bit more sensitive to extreme rhetorics. Yes, and this is something worrying, and we saw first kind of test case in Hungary in 2000, during the last local parliamentary election, when they get like 15% of votes. We are now approaching Slovakia's elections. Yes, SNS already is playing with anti-Roma rhetorics openly, but we are also hearing mainstream politicians who are talking similar language, and this is really concerning. This is something which is a danger, yes, because it's like a disease, yes. You can maybe think that this virus, you are strong, you can overcome it, but maybe this virus will cause a damage to you. So we have to warn a little bit mainstream politicians about the way they think they can play a politics in future. This is a danger.
Okay, that's good.
If we would go back in time with 10 years or a bit more, we would see that what was different from today is exactly the political discourse or politics in general. If we are looking now into what is happening in several European countries, we would very clearly see that politics have been deteriorating a lot. Now, there are many things which we have to consider. Anti-Romani sentiment or anti-Romani prejudice was all there. 20 years ago, it was the same high level of anti-Romani sentiment. But now we see a gap which has been widened between the situation of the Roma and the majority of the population. We have the economic crisis. The economic crisis in Europe has affected the majority of the population, but has had a much greater impact on the vulnerable groups, and in particular on the Roma communities. This widening of the situations, this big difference, is fueling prejudice, rejection, exclusion of this minority, the Roma minority in particular. Now, the economic crisis is playing an important role in terms of feeling insecure as a mainstream citizen. You cannot feel but insecure about what is happening. Having this situation, there is an erosion of trust in governments. There is a lack of trust in the political environment. So the parties have to find something in order to counterbalance this erosion. So where is that? It is exactly on minorities, immigrants, criminality, Roma. Putting this issue on the table in terms of political debate and mixing up with the insecurity of the majority of the people, it seems that it works, it pays votes. Yeah. So we have the case of France, when mainstream government representatives have been involved in anti-Romani rhetoric. We have the case in Italy, where the same mainstream government representatives have been involved in anti-Romani rhetoric. And then we go to Central Eastern European countries, Czech Republic, Hungary. In Slovakia now, for example, in the political debate, in the political campaigns, we can find banners on the streets. How long do we have to pay for the gypsies? This should stop. So it is an issue for political campaign. And if 15 years ago only extreme right parties or extreme right movements were playing this card, now it is played by the mainstream as well, because at the end of the day it pays votes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Adderhall, thank you so very much. Let me just ask a couple of final questions and then ask you if you have any final comments you'd like to make. Mr. Mirga, you mentioned that there is a need for more Roma in police forces. I would just note parenthetically, there may be a model that needs to be replicated throughout all of Europe, and that's Northern Ireland. I actually chaired 11 congressional hearings, including in the Subcommittee on Human Rights, which I chair, and our commission here, on the need for integration of Catholics into the Northern Irish Police Force. It used to be called the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And Mr. Patton, who went on to be foreign minister for the EU with very distinguished career, authored what was known as the Patton Report that made sweeping recommendations to London as to what they need to do to make that police force more responsive. And I always argued that I felt that was the Achilles heel. You don't get peace if you don't have a police force that's fair and unbiased, professionally trained, has a human rights focus to it. And I'm wondering if there's any attempt to try to take the Northern Irish model and replicate it elsewhere, because they have recruited very fine officers, through in the Catholic community, and now that force is working very cohesively. If you ring up a policeman, you're not going to get somebody who might commit a human rights abuse, although there are bad apples or bad policemen in any police force, but not based on sectarian issues, or at least it's less likely now. And I'm wondering, has there been a look at the experience in Northern Ireland? And secondly, what countries are getting that right and bringing Roma into the police force?
2 years ago, together with SPMU from Vienna, we published a booklet on police and Roma, building trust between police and Roma. It contains a lot of good practices collected from various countries about what police can do in multi-ethnic society, how they can increase representation of minorities in the police forces. So Ireland's example probably is also included there. What we are trying now to do is to promote this booklet and to launch in national languages. So we had already 2 such launches, one in Romania, one in Hungary. When we were on the field visit in Hungary, we were paying attention to the issue of representation of Roma in police forces, especially because we had this number of killings there. And we were meeting with Roma as well, who were police officers. At the time when we were in the field, on the field visit, the spokesperson for Roma, for national police was a Roma himself, young Roma police officer. In Vienna, where we were launching the book, we had 3 Roma officers. One, the spokesperson of the police from Hungary, a policewoman from Hungary, and a Roma officer from UK, from Metropolitan Police. And he was a Czech Roma who migrated to UK, and there he became a police officer, a first ever Roma officer in the police force in UK. So we have some of the examples, yes. In Hungary, for example, there is around 300 Roma in the police force. It's a significant number. However, and paradoxically, in this country we had this series of attacks, yes. During the elections in this country, trade union, police trade union, have had agreement with Jobbik to support Jobbik. So this is a kind of a confusing messages, yes, coming from police forces. Kind of exceptional situation, yes. In some other countries, in Romania, there is number of Roma in the police forces as well, but less than in Hungary. Some Roma are in police forces in Bulgaria, but not much, yes. So this is something which should be encouraged and bring in more and more, and to have Roma and a career, open career for them to be done. And this can contribute, of course, to the improvement of the integration of Roma into society. So this is something still ahead.
Let me just ask you with regards to countries like Germany that continue to deport Roma to Kosovo 13 years later, where the prospects of reintegration, unless it's very carefully done, could be a very, very painful experience, especially when you have forced repatriation being a part of it. What is the status of that? Is Germany and others still doing that? And what happens when that person who is forcibly repatriated arrives in Kosovo?
2 years ago, there was a briefing in US, in Bundestag. I was part of this briefing on the situation of Roma of Kosovo and about the policy of Germany vis-à-vis those who are in Germany and supposedly should be going back. Yes, our official position was that why Germany has a right to do what they do, because there was agreement, a temporal protection was provided after the conflict to victims of the conflict, yes, including Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians. And when they consider that there are already safe conditions in Kosovo, so they should be going back, we were saying that maybe it's a premature action, it's maybe not right timing, there are still tensions there, economic, social opportunities for those who are returned are very minor. So in fact, the decision to send them back puts them in very bad situation after return there. The second, those who are returned may not be going to Kosovo itself, because some of them were asked where they want to go, to Belgrade or to Pristina. Most of them were choosing to go to Pristina, and not to Pristina, to Belgrade. When we were trying, for example, to identify Roma who were returned in Kosovo, it was very difficult to find people, because they were already not there. So maybe the policy of so-called voluntary or forced return is not effective at all, because people staying 10, 12, 13 years in Germany, living there, having their networks there, being with families, suddenly deported, they will try to find a way to go back. We were visiting also Roma communities in Mitrovica, southern Mitrovica, which is rebuilt now. US also gave some funding for rebuilding and closing in the north lead polluted camps. And again, we are trying to find the people there from Germany, whether they are there. We found one person, yes, a young 20 years old man who spent half of his life in Germany, spoke perfectly German, and who suddenly was taken, put in on the airplane and sent back. And he was completely lost in this environment. Yes, all his families and friends are there. So what he's doing here? Yes. So my conviction, my point, my view is that Germany should rethink its policy, disregard that there are some agreements, they are entitled to do this. It might be not effective. On the other hand, in Germany, there is a movement among the Roma and supporters to argue to have them stay in Germany. Romani Rose is one of the leading Roma activists in Germany who is advocating for this also with the government. So there is a hope maybe that some of them may stay.
Commissioner Ederholt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I could interject for just a minute. I am between meetings. I've been at a hearing all morning. It's sort of been a crazy day for hearings on the Hill today. But before I do slip out, I did want to ask about two countries in particular. The next likely candidates for NATO membership, Montenegro and Macedonia. What is your assessment of the situation of the Roma in those two countries, just briefly?
Well, as regards Macedonia, there is a significant Roma population, contrary to Montenegro. There is very tiny Roma community, though in Montenegro you have a large number of Roma from Kosovo who left, yes, around over 4,000, and they are still living in camp, yes, where are very bad conditions. In Macedonia, you have, as I said, significant Roma population, which benefited, paradoxically, from the crisis, which was in beginning of 2000 with Albanians. Yes, there was an Ohrid agreement, and Ohrid agreement requires minorities, communities to benefit for equitable representation in public office, in employment, and that pays also to Roma, not only to Albanian minority. No, I should not say minority. Yes. So because of that, you may see Roma represented in many offices of the government and authorities. So there is in Macedonia, yes, there is actually a minister, a Roma, in the government. There is a deputy minister, another Roma. There are several directors in various departments. So in this sense, Roma benefited because of the Ohrid agreement, because it goes to all the communities in the country. Another thing is what is the situation of Roma in terms of social, economic, human rights, and so on. This is a little bit different. Yes, we have a big municipality, Roma municipality in Skopje. It's over 30,000 people, with a mayor, council built up by the Roma themselves. Yes, so Roma are visible in the country. They are represented in some offices, not yet to the level they should, because there is a percentage which it was not reached yet, but this is something progressing. Comparing this with Montenegro, yes, well, they started just now to have a Roma council, and there is a consultation process with the Roma. There was a new census, and which included Roma, and we know a little bit more now how many Roma are there. This is important because of the representation eventually in the parliament. If you reach some threshold, you can have a representation in the parliament. So this is something evolving also with regard to representation. There are few educated people, though, in the country, around 20. They are educated and they are not working sometimes. So one of the issues which we raised with them, with the government, is that as an example of positive practice, as a role model for others to follow in education, they should give some jobs to these few Roma educated in the country. So we see some Roma who will be selected probably by the government to take some positions. So, as I said, main problem now for the Montenegro Roma population is Roma in the camp, yes, which is a big one in Podgorica, Konik camp, over 4,000 people living on the dump. You mentioned sometimes the dump. It is leveled dump, and they are there, of course, surrounded by other people as well, but the conditions are dire there. So there is an effort a little bit now to improve the conditions, living conditions there. Commission is ready to put some money for rehabilitation, but we have to see how it will evolve in next years.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would. Just a few things about Macedonia. In terms of positive developments, we might mention that the government has acknowledged the situation, has adopted a policy for improving the situation of Roma. And another thing is that, as a positive practice, is that Macedonia adopted a law for legalization of property rights, which might be of high importance for Roma, because that means legalizing informal settlements or providing recognition of property, land property for Roma. So from this point of view, Macedonia is a good example to be mentioned. It would be very interesting to follow up on the process of the implementation of this law to see exactly if the Roma would benefit from this law in terms of recognition of properties, because you may know that housing is an outstanding issue for Roma communities. They live in informal settlements. Most of the times, local authorities, they do not recognize the properties, the land, in particular land properties. So this law could be of high importance for Roma. On the other hand, in terms of the human rights situation, there are as well a couple of areas where Macedonia has to improve. It's not only the employment, education, health, but in terms of law reforms, for example, the legal framework for protecting against discrimination still has to be improved. In education, there are a couple of cases where the Roma children are enrolled in special schools for children with intellectual disability, even though they are not disabled. So there are a couple of issues where Macedonia has to still improve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gergely, can I just ask you, I chair the Autism Caucus here in the United States, and actually wrote the law in '98, just did it again last year, to put considerable money into autism, best practices, and early intervention out beyond anything else that we might do, particularly in age 2 or 3 or 4, any earlier the better, can have a tremendous impact on whether or not that child has a better life as he or she grows into adulthood. I'm working closely with some Europeans in the European Parliament on autism. It's a big problem there. I just chaired a hearing last year on global autism, and the estimates are that there are some 67 million people worldwide who have or somewhere on the Asperger, either severely autistic or moderately, and it's just an emerging problem that we're not sure what the trigger is, and there may be multiple triggers, but it seems to me that autism, especially since it's all over Europe, all over the United States, has to be a problem, and many kids, children who happen to be Roma, might be further disadvantaged because the early intervention initiatives are not available to them. And I'm wondering if there's been an effort to include them. Education per se for Roma children is substandard because of inadequate response by governments anyway. But this is above and beyond because testing needs to be done. Just a general sense of why is my child not behaving the way he or she ought to may not trigger the response, and if those social services are not there, and if the educational establishment is not working to help those kids, they are further disadvantaged. Your thoughts on that?
Well, this is an outstanding issue for Roma children as well. European Roma Rights Center was involved in lodging several complaints on behalf of Roma children before the European Court of Human Rights. And we have a couple of decisions, one against the Czech Republic, one against Croatia. There is another decision against Greece, and there are several examples of cases before national courts, Romania, Hungary. It seems that it is a practice to enroll Romani children in separate classes, separate schools, or special schools for mental disabled children. In the absence of any medical record that these children would need a special education, a special attention paid for. What we are advocating a lot is that Romani children have to be enrolled in mainstream schools. The practice of segregating Romani children, either in segregated classes, segregated and annexes to the schools, or special schools, has to be ended. And the decisions from the European Court are in this regard. The problem is that in a lot of member states, there is a lack of reform in the educational systems. The governments are a bit reluctant in reforming systems. Czech Republic is maybe one of the cases where we had a decision from 2007, and the government is still struggling in reforming the educational system after 5 years from this decision, when the government had to reform its system on the basis of the court decision, and still that is not the case. So we have several situations in other countries as well. Unfortunately, it is a practice in Europe to put Romani children in segregated spaces, I would say.
Could I ask you, with regards to autism, whether or not there's ever been a surveillance? And again, going back to 1998, I introduced a bill that was signed into law in 2000 that required the Centers for Disease Control to set up centers of excellence, as we call them. And it really came out of casework in my own district, where we thought we had a prevalence spike in Bricktown, New Jersey. And when we started, or they started doing their data calls, they found out that other municipalities had a similar rise, inexplicable. And we went from believing that the prevalence rate in the United States was 3 out of every 10,000 children to 1 out of every 110. And I'm not sure if they're not part of the surveillance, large numbers of Romani children could be left further behind because their autism has not been discovered, and early intervention and other, segregation for a severely autistic child is required as long as they're getting services that is commensurate with the problems that they face so that they can become better functioning. But if it's done just to, as you are clearly saying, to separate in the way that African Americans were separated in this country years ago through laws that were just to set apart, that's prejudicial and discriminatory and certainly totally unethical. But I wonder if that's been even looked into the way it ought to be.
It was not substantially looked upon, but the other problem is also the lack of a proper testing procedure when they are applied to Romani children, because this is where the problem starts. They are enrolled in special schools without being properly tested. So basically they are enrolled on the basis of a social economic disadvantage, not on the basis of a medical ground. Right. This is what is happening.
Right.
In Europe.
You know, just for pondering, we're pushing more police understanding of what a severely or even moderately autistic child might be experiencing, because that child, as he or she becomes an adult, might fly off the handle, and the cop will respond in a way that then leads to an altercation. The child gets, a young adult, incarcerated, and they're dealing with a disability that made them prone or almost predetermined, given the right trigger, to respond negatively and then go to jail. So we have children, young adults I should say, in our own jails who shouldn't be there, who are really medical issues that went unaddressed. And I'm sure they've got to be occurring within the Romani community. Let me just ask one final question, and then yield to Erica Schleger, our expert. One thing about and you know this, I think, about this commission is that we are blessed with very, very talented and effective staff who make it their business 24/7, year in and year out, to know, understand, and work the issues, including the Romani issue, human rights issues. So I will yield to her. I just want to ask one final question on trafficking. In your report, Mr. Gergely, you make it very clear that, and this is just one fact that you have in there, 24% of the Romani trafficked persons interviewed in this study, the Break in the Silence study, had been in contact with the police, and only one case resulted in the imprisonment of the perpetrator. You point out in the study the overwhelming lack of support available to Romani trafficked persons negatively impacts the ability of many to reintegrate, leaving them highly vulnerable to re-trafficking. And of course that is true anywhere. It's true here. When they don't get the kind of services that they need, as soon as they're back out on the street, if you will, even if rescued, the traffickers are waiting there to re-enslave them. And you also, in your recommendations, say there needs to, and this would be to you, Mr. Mirga, to promote networking between Romani NGOs, Romani mediators, and Romani community representatives, law enforcement, and anti-trafficking authorities to combat trafficking in Romani communities. And I'm wondering, since all of our countries now have plans of actions, or at least almost all, including the OSCE space, are they looking to put that piece in so that the Romani, who are disproportionately trafficked, have those reintegration services available to them so they're not enslaved a second and a third and a fourth time?
Well, as I said before, the problem is that in several countries this is not acknowledged as an issue, so therefore you do not have a policy which addresses this. That's why we recommended in the report that there should be a networking in place, meaning cooperation between the communities and the law enforcement. This, unfortunately, is lacking because the law enforcement doesn't see it as an issue which has to be tackled in a particular way. But this is applicable to other areas, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues which should be raised here is neglect. Yes? Neglect. Yes. And this goes in many other areas. Yes? Not only in the issue of law enforcement and their care about something like victims of trafficking, yes? Because if they identify something like a Roma, well, this is kind of less an issue. Similarly with education, yes, why Roma children are not in the school if there is an obligation for having them in the school? Sometimes school authorities just neglect their obligation to control and enforce that they should be in school, not outside of the school. So in this way, we can see that Roma are sometimes a second-class citizen, yes, whether in the situation of victims or in the situation of children who should be in school. And we see this in many places. And so something like, if we expect Roma to be included into the society, we should and be treated equally, or sometimes even positive discrimination applied. We have to get rid of this kind of negligence and neglect, closing eyes on the issues, and we should apply strongly the existing law. Yes, if there is a convention of child protection, if there is a law which says until, I don't know, secondary education, a child has to be in school, authorities should enforce this. Not just neglect because you are Roma, we don't care what you do. So this is one of the source of being left out completely in many situations, including, trafficking. The second thing about trafficking, I think we already pointed out that there is a lack of a little bit of real commitments to fight against. Yes, I know the situation in some of the countries where because of the pressure from outside and providing funding, there were many agencies created to deal with anti-trafficking. But when you try to push to get some data, what has been, how this was effective to prevent trafficking, you cannot get positive results. It's simply the procedure is continued and you do not see positive results. So that is what is concerning. Multiplying agencies, institutions, which absorbs funding, various funding from donors, let's say, but you do not see a real progress in stopping the process.
I'd like to yield to Gergely Schlegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 years ago, at the time of the murders in Tatar St. George in Hungary, there was, I think, quite a lot of shock at the brutality of the murder of the father and son there. And two prominent Romani-Hungarian public officials spoke to this. Florian Farkas warned that Hungary could be headed towards civil war, and Victoria Mohacs said Roma would have no choice but to arm themselves or flee. Without limiting yourself to Hungary, that is, speaking more broadly to this phenomena in Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, elsewhere, how do you view the prospect of interethnic violence? Thank you.
Well, I think that in the situation like we had in Hungary, first reaction was to escape. Yes, you had a rise in people who were migrating. Yes, similarly in Czech Republic, we had a crisis with immigrants who were going to Canada. Canada had to introduce visas. Now we have again similar things in Western Balkans when you have significant number of Roma asking for asylum, claiming the situation. So I think first reaction is to avoid something like being targeted by some groups, by extreme and leave. Yes, the second, if this is not a way out, yes, and you have to stay, so the potential for some, I would not say inter-ethnic conflicts, but victimizing the weaker, yes, because Roma are not strong enough to stand up, yes. So more kind of a violence against the Roma may happen. And we warn against that, especially in the context of a continuing crisis where you will see more austerity programs which will impact welfare transfers to Roma who are mostly dependent on welfare. So you may see this kind of situations where Roma can be victimized by majority because there is a growing resentment against the Roma, yes, stirred up by some elements in society. I would, in my view, I would not see this like a real conflict like we had with, let's say, between Albanians and Macedonians in Macedonia, like a real civil war, but more like something which the weaker will be suffering more. Yes? So that's what I feel may happen more often.
What I would add is that the environment now is very critical. The economic crisis in Europe on one hand, the deterioration of the political environment, the gap in terms of social and economic situation of the Roma, these factors put the Roma community at a high risk. Of course, that when we see all these manifestations against the Roma taking place in several countries, when the political environment is changing, unfortunately not in a very positive way, but rather on a negative way, you cannot but wonder where it would lead to. So I think that the sentiment of the Roma communities is not a safe and a secure sentiment. It's one of insecurity, is one of lacking the feeling of being protected. So it is extremely important that when member states are addressing the issues of the Roma communities, they are not focusing only on economic or social perspective, but rather they see it as an interdependent process with ensuring human rights. If human rights are not protected, if you do not have a human rights-based perspective, which is mixed with a social and economic perspective, and without having an inclusive approach, as long as we keep the Roma communities outside and the majority of the societies on the other side, we will never reach to a common ground, but we will be all the time parallel without reaching anything. So I think that the member state has to really see this danger which is there, and they should really put together this economic and social perspective with ensuring human rights protection. That's the most outstanding issue now.
Yes, just to add something to the question, yes, we see something which is completely new, yes, mass protest against the Roma, yes. It never happened before. We had eventually a community violence, yes, local community was against Roma community. That happened many times in many places since transition. But to have somehow mobilized a large number of majority and have them going outside on the streets to protest against the Roma, this is something new, and this is very worrying. Yes, something new is also how extreme right is organizing people. In North Bohemia, these groups are organizing protests, and they are joined by normal citizens, young people, yes? And these organizations are small, but they are mastering to have several hundred or thousand people going against the community, yes, against something new, never similar things were happening in the past. And this shows the direction, yes, how things can evolve, yes, that, as I said, you may have this kind of victimization of a weaker in this relationship, Roma majority. And we have to speak about this, we have to raise awareness about this, we have also to ask US to react to this. Governments have to realize that protection of the community is the first, and to diffuse this kind of action which are undertaken by some elements of the majority. I would like to, for example, to appreciate steps made by Bulgaria when the riots started and these mass protests were organized in several cities. They arrested over 100 people. And after, we do not hear any more about such organized protests against the Roma. Also, what is positive thing, during the local elections, Ataka didn't do well. They lost. They had over 200-something councillors in the local elections in the previous time. Now they have much less, like 1/3 of this. Yes? So maybe either population or politician understood that such a aggressive anti-Roma politics is not anymore right, and it's not based. So society didn't buy it in general. So I would like to encourage this kind of firm, unwavering a position of the leadership, yes, of the government, of the president, leaders of the mainstream parties, which stands on principles, yes, and they saying this is not acceptable. We condemn this in a uniform voice, yes, and that's also what we would like to see happening from the US, that these strong messages about the principles should be going straight forward to a number of countries.
Mr. Gergely, is the United States, from the President to the Vice President, Secretary of State, speaking bold enough, with enough specificity on the Roma issues to our European friends?
Yes, they are. I mean, State Secretary Hillary Clinton has a history in taking firm standing on Roma issues. Of course, having a similar message from the President of the United States would be something which would very much have a very clear and outreaching message to the European countries.
Has he mentioned it? Has the President of the United States mentioned it? Or
Not yet, but it would be something which would give a strong message for Europe, I think, in terms of protecting human rights for minorities. We are looking very much forward for US to have a similar standing and a position on Roma issues as it was until now.
Thank you. And I do have one final question. The World Bank, in a report, suggested that if there was full integration of the Roma community into the labor market, that about €500 million per year, annually, obviously, for some countries would be the result, the positive consequences. So it's not just a human rights issue, an humanitarian issue, and a simple justice issue. It's also a very positive economic issue if full integration were to occur. And I'm wondering, is that appreciated by governments, that they're missing out of a positive economic benefit for the rest of the community if they were to integrate?
What I would say is, if you look around in Europe, we would see that a lot of political commitments have been in place in terms of improving the Roma situation. A lot of governments have adopted policies for improving the Roma situation, but unfortunately, the governmental commitments which were undertaken have been diluted at local level, which shows that in practice, having a commitment is not enough. On the other hand, when the governments were adopting policies for improving the Roma situation, what they were missing to put there beside the commitment was the financial resources for implementing those policies. So of course, in order to ensure employment, you need resources for providing trainings, for providing education, skills, and so on and so forth, jobs, market, formal market. It's not easy at all. It is a long process. It takes time, but unfortunately, the governments are not committing their resources for implementing such policies. Now, there is a lot of expectation from the European Union, because the European Union has adopted the framework communication on the policies. Now, all the member states are expected to develop and to have the policies for the next 10 years. There is a lot of emphasis on the financial resources because the Union has the financial resources in place. The only thing is that the member states have to apply for, have to request, have to have the capacity. The reports from the European Union shows that the European funds absorption rates from the states are extremely low. With other words, the states are not able to absorb the financial resources which the European Union puts in place. So now the question is, if the member states are absorbing less than 30% of the available funds, how would they be able to absorb funds for Roma strategies? So the outstanding question here is whether the states are able not to put their own money, but to get the money from the Union in order to implement the policies on Roma.
Just to comment on your question, I think this is very valid